as goofy as some of the stories can wind up being in some of the Metal Gear and Final Fantasy games, there are actually good, interesting lessons behind them.
And if we're lucky, maybe gamers will apply those lessons to real life.
So you like Xenosaga?
Yes.
What the is your problem?
While it might seem unfathomable now, there was a time in the early 2000s when Xenosaga was looked at as a potential contender for a top spot on the list of big-budget AAA JRPGs. Unfortunately, less than phenomenal sales and somewhat lackluster reviews led to the series being cut down from 6 games to 3, which was a bit of a bummer. Even though it died an early death in 2006, the trilogy remains one of my all-time favorites, and if you couldn't tell from the title or runtime of this video, I've got way too much to say about it. If you're even watching this, then you're likely already familiar with Xenosaga. Content surrounding this trilogy is pretty thin on the ground these days. Odds are you wound up here after searching for a compilation of the trilogy's cutscenes or news of an HD remaster that'll never happen. But on the offhand chance that you have no idea what this series is about, and I haven't already sent you scrambling for the back button, then let me give you an overview. Released between 2002 and 2006, Xenosaga is a trilogy of science fiction JRPGs for the PlayStation 2 that contains a single, cohesive narrative. True to its space opera roots, it features a wide cast of characters, multiple political factions vying for power, and a host of interplanetary space battles. As far as its story goes, it takes place thousands of years after humans have fled Earth and colonized planets across the galaxy. While humanity first found itself to be utterly alone in the galaxy, they're eventually met with a new foe, the Gnosis, an apparent alien species that have been slowly driving humanity to the brink of extinction. So, amidst the backdrop of all these intergalactic conflicts, conspiracies with far-reaching consequences, and space wizards speaking enigmatically and doing space wizard things, we as an audience find ourselves privy to a surprisingly personal, character-driven journey led by Shion Uzuki. Shion is a scientist and programmer for Vector Industries, and leads the project to create Cosmos, a humanoid weapon capable of fighting the Gnosis. Following an attack on Shion's fleet at the start of the first game, she quickly finds herself swept up in a web of conflicts that both forces her to come to terms with her traumatic past, and leads her and her growing list of allies to, you guessed it, save the universe. Sort of. But we'll get there. Xenosaga is weird, it's quirky, and those are kind of part of the reasons why I love it so much. Sometime before I left for college, I slipped Xenosaga into a booklet with a handful of my other favorite PS1 and PS2 JRPGs, and these games, they've been with me everywhere. 13 years and something like 5 cross-country moves later, it's safe to say that this collection of games is one of my oldest possessions. But even though they've been with me all this time, until recently it'd been over a decade since I last played them. Still, I was surprised to find that I remembered every bit of these games like my mind was stuck back in 2006. Of course, it's no secret that games can stay with us for any number of reasons. Sometimes it's as simple as chilling atmosphere, or the feeling you got when you took down a difficult boss, or maybe even the memory of playing late into the night with friends, long after you're told to go to bed. In Xenosaga's case, it remained so present in my mind throughout the years because of its story. The games themselves are fun, I love watching damage numbers go up as much as the next guy, but I found myself more drawn to the mysteries it presented, as well as its fairly layered and introspective characters. The series had scope. Honestly, when I consider the initial ambition and direction behind the project, I'm shocked these games were made at all. You see, much like the Metal Gear series, Xenosaga has stood out in its niche corner of the pop culture subconscious for its complicated plot, iconic characters, and for being a little overly self-indulgent. Unfortunately, Xenosaga never even hit a fraction of the success that Metal Gear did, and, as I said before, was cancelled just 3 games into a planned 6-game run. I bring up Metal Gear because the quality that made that series unique among its peers is the same quality that made Xenosaga unique, a strong sense of thematic cohesion, orchestrated by directors with an uncommon level of creative self-awareness. Don't get me wrong, there's very few games made by just one person. There's entire teams of people supporting these projects. But unlike your typical video game, it's difficult and likely impossible to separate these projects from their directors because their DNA is so tightly woven into the final product. Anyways, that brings me to the why of this video, because if I'm going to talk about Xenosaga for however long this video ends up being, I'm better off giving myself a roadmap so we don't get too sidetracked. Well, like I've alluded to, this series has made a sizable impact on me. An impact that I was never able to fully appreciate or even recognize until my recent playthrough. Yeah, sure, it's a video game about space wizards and anime robot girls, but on a more serious note, it also has a lot to say about how we process trauma, burdens we place on ourselves, and moving past failure. And it's that last bit I want to take a look at. You see, when I finally decided to revisit the series some 15 years later, I found myself curious to learn more about the behind-the-scenes story of the series' development, and as I continued to read and learn, I found a narrative that felt, in some sort of thematic sense, mirrored within the trilogy itself. Maybe that's just the benefit of hindsight, but when I stopped to consider the fact that the series was cut short, there's this through line that became apparent to me. One that contemplated the idea of failure, like, how do we move past it? Or what does it mean to fall short of our own expectations? These musings, on an abstract level I'm sure, are definitely part of what made these games stick with me for such a long time. And to make sense of it all, that's what I'll be exploring in this video. The ways in which the narrative, and dare I say, meta-narrative, of Xenosaga contextualizes and challenges our notions of failure. But to get there, I'm gonna have to start at the beginning. So I'll probably be spoiling the shit out of the entire Xeno franchise. So, you know, smash that back button if you want to avoid spoilers. Alright, let's move on.
Must take the A train.
I suppose the first thing that you should know going into this is that the Xenosaga trilogy is the middle child of a larger game franchise, normally just referred to as the Xeno series. Its siblings include Xenogears, released in 1998, and the Xenoblade Chronicles series, which began in 2010. Aside from the prefix of their titles, these games don't share much aside from themes, ideas, and iconography. There's no grand narrative arc connecting them all. Not yet, at least. The series has been on somewhat of an interesting journey over the last 2 decades. No doubt the natural result of 3 different publishers and a game developer's passion for crafting rich, complex worlds. Worlds with themes of creation and purpose found at the center of stories dealing with human nature, God, religion, as well as inner and outer turmoil. And like all creative endeavors, these projects have also been faced with budgetary and time constraints throughout their various development cycles. But as I see it, there's a spirit and passion for storytelling and world building that persists throughout these games, and that spirit seems to mostly shrug off whatever obstacles their real-world development teams have been faced with. As a result, the series has amassed a sizable following of fans over the years. But to talk about this universe at all is to talk about the main brain behind most of it, Tetsuya Takahashi. There's a long list of developers who've worked alongside him to make this franchise possible, but I'm going to focus on him because he's the one constant throughout the story. Plus, his growth as a creative and as an individual is central to a lot of my core ideas. So, anyways, Takahashi joined game developer and publisher Squaresoft in 1990, around the age of 24, and soon began working on the battle graphics of Final Fantasy IV. It was during his time at Square that he met his future wife and frequent creative partner, Kaori Tanaka, otherwise known by her pen name, Soraya Saga. Takahashi would continue to be an integral part of the Final Fantasy team for the next several years, and through impressing his peers and superiors as his rank and roles across different projects grew, by the end of 1995, he finally received the opportunity to direct his first game, Xenogears. Details of the events that led up to the formation of the Xenogears team aren't all that complicated. They're rather well known within its community of fans, but the information and level of detail given to us over the years has varied from interview to interview as levels of candor has waxed and waned. So, I've taken what we do know and just arranged it in a manner that I think makes the most sense. During Takahashi's time on the core Final Fantasy team, we know that he was becoming increasingly frustrated with the approach taken to the series, and was becoming equally insistent on getting the opportunity to create his own world. In 1994, during the earliest stages of Final Fantasy VII's development, he submitted a proposal for the upcoming title that he and Soraya Saga had worked on together. The proposed treatment held some rough ideas for what some of the core story, characters, and concepts could be, but it was ultimately turned down with the primary feedback being that it was too dark and too science fiction heavy for a Final Fantasy game. It was this proposal that would later become the foundation of Xenogears. For a short while after, he continued his work on the Final Fantasy VII team. He's even credited as a concept artist, and some of the concepts from his and Saga's proposal, like the soldier with multiple personalities, would find their way into the finished product in some form. But partway through development, he gave into his frustrations. It seems that one of his biggest gripes with the game wasn't even so much the concept of the world it explored, as much as it was how they went about building that world. What I mean is, Final Fantasy VII came out at a time when video games were slowly transitioning from 2D to 3D. But because the technology was a foreign land for everyone, the team was tasked with redesigning how this genre would be presented to the player with its newly added dimension. Eventually, they decided on utilizing a combination of pre-rendered backgrounds and three-dimensional character models. The pre-rendered backgrounds could be highly detailed while not eating up too much data, and multiple pre-rendered assets could be stacked on top of one another, like Photoshop layers, which allowed for a sense of depth as a 3D character model traversed a set path and intersected with various objects on the screen. Takahashi wasn't a fan of this approach. He believed that a fully three-dimensional world would be much more immersive. At some point, he confided in mentor and Final Fantasy creator Hironobu Sakaguchi that he was looking to take on a new challenge. In a 2018 interview, Takahashi more openly described his mindset during that time period by saying, "I can't go along with someone who doesn't want to go in the same direction as me. I was also young then too, so I questioned myself. Why am I making something I don't even want to? We didn't really fight or anything, we're good friends and we went out and ate together. I don't hate them, but I just didn't feel right about it. That took a toll on me, so I wanted to leave the team and make something else." Sakaguchi, having long been impressed with Takahashi's work over the years, was able to use his considerable influence within the company to net Takahashi his own team of developers, allowing him to helm his very first game as director. The rejected concept he and Saga had pitched for Final Fantasy VII would actually serve as the basis for their first game. At first, the project was conceived as a potential sequel to 1995's Chrono Trigger, but for unclear reasons, this idea was quickly scrapped, usually chalked up to disagreements between the team and higher-ups from Square. So, Takahashi found himself with a team largely made up of inexperienced developers and something of a blank check to create his first original IP. He was no longer bound by the notions of what a Final Fantasy game should be or by rules and restrictions put in place by some past director's work. The twice-rejected proposal was further retooled and became the earliest version of what we now know as Xenogears. After roughly 2 years in development, Xenogears was released in 1998 to critical acclaim. It was hailed as a singularly unique experience, unlike anything that had come before it, and it's not hard to see why. Xenogears thrived in a gray area, rarely explored by games until then. It asked questions about the purpose of life, if fractured people could really ever heal. The characters dealt with grief, depression, and coming to terms with who they really were. It wasn't just some journey to thwart an evil scheme. It was about who the characters were and what motivated them. And even if it didn't reach the same level of commercial success as its contemporaries, it left an unmistakable mark on fans and on the industry itself. Of course, all wasn't perfect. What criticism the game did receive was generally aimed towards the latter half, due to the dramatic shift in structure. At some point during development, the decision was made to have the second half of the game play out more like a visual novel, with characters providing inner monologues and explaining a lot of the point A to point B developments following what's roughly the halfway point. So really the only time player input is required after that is for boss fights and exploration segments that mostly open back up before the very end. The urban legend most prominent on the internet then was that the development team had simply run out of money, and thus cut corners. But we'd learn later on that the decision came from Takahashi himself, and that, like all things, it was more complicated than widely believed. According to Takahashi, the steep learning curve in navigating and implementing the technology that allowed his team to follow through on their vision for the game meant that it took longer to develop than originally estimated. And at some point during its development cycle, it became clear that the game wasn't going to reach its deadline. This was maybe doubly true because of Takahashi's continued writing and expansion of the Xenogears lore and characters even as they were well into production. So they reached a crossroads, and Takahashi was urged to just cut the plot in half, but he refused. Instead of cutting content, the young director had the back half of the game adopt the style of a visual novel RPG hybrid, as means of avoiding giving players what he no doubt considered a half-baked, incomplete experience. Even in the final product, the game remains every bit as ambitious as its director. But it wasn't until the very end of the credits that players were hit with the reveal that this game was just part of a much, much larger whole. For Takahashi, it was meant to be the 5th installment in a 6-part series. He had envisioned Xenogears as a multi-part, multimedia project with work-spanning games and books and no doubt other mediums. This project was, and arguably would remain for some time, Takahashi's greatest passion. It contains a sprawling universe with thousands of years of lore that he was intent on bringing to life. But even though Xenogears was a critical and commercial success, it still didn't sell quite as well as Squaresoft had hoped, especially when compared to their latest golden child. It's difficult to overstate just what a massive success Final Fantasy VII was for Square. The game effectively introduced the JRPG genre into the mainstream of the North American gaming market, and it turned the company into a multinational world-class corporation virtually overnight. Squaresoft had finally cracked into the Western market after years of false starts, so I'd understand if they were keen to ride that wave and focus on the Final Fantasy franchise. Unfortunately for Takahashi and his team, that seems to be exactly what happened. Xenogears falling short of its sales goal and Squaresoft being more than thrilled to focus on Final Fantasy led to Takahashi falling into a state of limbo during his remaining time at Square. The lack of creative freedom afforded to him and his team, and their subsequent inability to launch new projects, wound up leading to Takahashi's departure from the company, and he wasn't alone. He was followed by fellow malcontents Hirohide Sugiura, Yasuyuki Hone, and roughly 17 others, almost the entire core staff from Xenogears. The group soon formed the development studio known as Monolith Soft, and after becoming a subsidiary of Namco, they began recruiting and teasing a new video game known only as Project X. This, of course, was later unveiled to the public as Xenosaga in 2001, and fans of Xenogears were quick to begin speculating on what the connection was between this game and Xenogears. You know, other than the names. The reason for this was partly because of Xenogears' Perfect Works, a book released in the year 2000 after Takahashi had left Square. It was written by him as a kind of encyclopedia for the original game, a compendium of concept art, detailed mech designs, and character information. And in something of a surprise, it provided additional context to the narrative in the form of a rough outline for the prequels and sequel to Xenogears. It was, in effect, a story about the birth, life, and death of the entire universe, one of the many concepts it would go on to share with Xenosaga. Due to the similar name and the initial reveal showcasing many concepts found within Xenogears and its companion book, the growing fan consensus was that Xenosaga was actually a prequel to Gears. Given the fact that Square holds the rights to Gears to this day, Takahashi was careful to avoid labeling the Saga series as a prequel, and instead referred to it as a sort of spiritual successor. It's pretty obvious, though, that Xenosaga was looking to be a fresh, second attempt at bringing this universe to life. If it had been able to tell its full story, it might have even retold pieces of the original Gears story in its own fashion. Maybe. It's tough to decipher the true scope of what Xenosaga was meant to be. Namco once called it a 6-part series. Takahashi also referred to the series as being 4 parts, and being primarily the story of series protagonist Shion Uzuki. Though, for the same token, it was definitely once declared that the story of Xenosaga would live on beyond Shion, and that the characters of Chaos and Cosmos would be the only recurring characters. It's not very clear, and there's no definitive answer that I can divine, but I definitely think that all of these statements are true. That Xenosaga was definitely each of these in turn at some point during its full development cycle from 2000 to 2006. Now, with all that backstory out of the way, we've arrived at Xenosaga Episode 1, Takahashi's second run at exploring the complicated story that he was clearly determined to bring to life. So, without further ado, it's about time that we finally talk about Xenosaga. Xenosaga Episode 1 begins on modern-day Earth with the discovery of a mysterious monolith known as the Zohar. The Zohar is something of a doorway between the human realm and the upper domain, and is thus the center of many schemes that will unfold later in the story. We then fast forward 4,000 years into the future, where humans have taken to space and have long forgotten the way to Earth, which is now called Lost Jerusalem. As I mentioned at the start, humans may inhabit thousands of planets across the galaxy, but have so far found themselves to be alone, with no signs of other intelligent life. I say intelligent because there's these creatures known as the Gnosis that function as one of the main threats of the series, but they tend to act more based on instinct than some sort of language or other form of communication. Plus, as we discover later in Episode 3, they're actually the departed souls of humans who were too scared to join the collective unconscious after death. Their fear of becoming part of a greater whole leads them to becoming a gnosis and subsequently residing in a dimension that's alongside but also separate from the one in which humans exist. This renders them near untouchable, and so they've been attacking the living and slowly driving humans towards extinction for years. At the start of Episode 1, we find ourselves, the player, in control of vector scientist Shion Uzuki. She's just wrapped production on a new humanoid weapon known as Cosmos, built with the ability to drag the Gnosis into the human dimension, or real number domain, and give humans a fighting chance. As luck would have it, the fleet she and her team are on is attacked by the Gnosis. At the same time, Cosmos, who has not yet been activated, mysteriously awakens and subsequently assists Shion, her co-worker Alan, and this guy in escaping. It's difficult to succinctly describe the through line of Xenosaga Episode 1 simply because its sequence of events are the results of, and build up to, over a dozen different plot threads that don't become thoroughly fleshed out until Episodes 2 and 3. So, in order to do this thing properly, I'm just going to spoil the broad strokes of the full trilogy, so that way I can lay it out as simply as possible. Personally, I think it's better to start with a full picture, so that when I go back to various points, character arcs, or themes within the trilogy, there's at least a little bit more context. Following the attack on their fleet, Shion, Alan, and Cosmos find themselves in the company of Junior, Chaos, Ziggy, and Momo, who are all, not coincidentally enough, also headed to the planet of Second Milsha. However, their journey gets sidetracked by Albedo, voiced by Crispin Freeman, who's clearly having the time of his life. Albedo's playing the long game here. He's after Momo, one of Shion's new traveling companions, and who happens to be a Realian, a type of synthetic human being. Momo holds the Y data in her memory banks. The Y data is a cache of information left behind by the late scientist Joachim Mizrahi. Some of the information contained within it includes the coordinates of Lost Jerusalem, instructions for creating the final dungeon of a video game, information on the Gnosis, and the keys to returning to Old Milsha. Old Milsha is the planet where the original Zohar is kept, and the entire planet was locked away following a conflict that happened 14 years before the start of Episode 1. In short, the Y data holds a ton of information coveted by a ton of people who are way too incompetent to uncover the information for themselves. The first installment ends as Shion and the rest spoil Albedo's fun when he attempts to drop an enormous space station onto Second Milsha, and they finally reach their destination. Episode 2 picks up exactly where we left off, with Shion and the rest of the group disembarking and going their separate ways, only to end up together again as they attempt to repair the damage Albedo inflicted on Momo's memories in the first game, when he failed to fully recover the Y data. What they don't realize is that it's a trap. A quick side note here. It's important to know that Albedo and Junior, aka Rubido, are actually twins, created in a lab as bioengineered weapons. Specifically, they were created with the means to cancel out the waves of Udu, an upper domain consciousness also known as a wave existence, and it's the closest thing Xenosaga has to a god. The twins' conjoined birth and eventual separation led to them each being given a unique ability. While Junior was given the ability to control his body's aging, Albedo received a body that would never die, that would constantly regenerate no matter the level of damage. Albedo's immortality terrified him, because it meant that he would be forced to continue living long after Junior's death, and all Albedo desires is to stay with his brother, even if it's adversarial. This guy was already an unstable mess, but 14 years before Episode 1, during a mission to eradicate Udu waves, Junior prematurely severed the mental link between himself, Albedo, and other members of their team. The sudden instability to their link allowed the wave existence to kill and infect nearly everyone in the vicinity, save for Junior. Albedo, of course, was one of the victims. His contact with the upper domain drove him to absolute insanity.
Mirror on the wall, show me, define me. I am the infinite telomerase.
Anyways, getting back to Shion and the rest, they learn the hard way that Albedo is able to use his connection with Junior as a means of diving into Momo's subconscious, and he finally retrieves the Y data. Using this newfound knowledge, he reopens the path to Old Milsha, where the original Zohar lies in wait. So the party travels to the once inaccessible planet, now joined by Shion's estranged brother Jin, and after fighting their way to the original Zohar and engaging in a bit of fisticuffs with the actual Pope, they fail to keep Albedo from using it as a conduit to completely fuse himself with Udu. As a result, the finale of Episode 2 sees Junior finally deciding to confront his brother, and because Albedo is now linked with Udo, Junior is able to use his abilities to eradicate the wave existence and give Albedo the death that he had longed for. Now, most of this Albedo stuff eats up the bulk of episodes 1 and 2, but it's ultimately just a sideshow to Wilhelm, who's perfectly content to let Albedo carry on with his scheming, only because it helps propel his own grand designs forward. Wilhelm is Vector's CEO. He's also the CEO of Heims, and later he is the Pope. He's everywhere. And he's using all these different roles as a means of manipulating different factions and entities to his benefit. As we learn in Episode 3, Wilhelm has existed for thousands of years, created to be the guardian of the human domain of the universe. However, the universe is fated to die for reasons, and so to keep it from collapsing in on itself, he's orchestrated the events of the series so that he can gather the necessary elements that will allow him to restart the universe again and again and again. This cycle is known as the Eternal Recurrence. To ignite the Eternal Recurrence, Wilhelm requires just a few household items: the original Zohar and its man-made copies, 12 vessels of anima, which are the divided power of chaos, aka Yeshua, who, side note by the way, performed much of Jesus' miracles back in the day. Wilhelm also needs the revived consciousness of Mary Magdalene, who is needed to activate the power of anima that will initiate the Eternal Recurrence. Oh yeah, and Shion is the reincarnation of the Maiden of Mary, which is a figure needed to unlock Mary's power. Alright, that's a lot, so let's pause there. All of this is a drastic oversimplification of what happens in the trilogy, and even though it all sounds fantastical and silly, and much too large for a character-driven tale, Xenosaga as a whole does a remarkable job of letting these events unfold methodically, as it remains focused on the motivating factors behind each of its cast members. To show you what I mean, let's take this guy, Andrew Cherenkov. Andrew Cherenkov is, for all intents and purposes, a side character. He's even arguably just a plot device to jumpstart the events of the first game, given that he's behind the Gnosis attack on Xian's fleet and a few other events. He only makes it halfway through Episode 1, and yet he's given a complexity and level of development rarely bestowed upon characters of his rank. Andrew is a super soldier, a product of the Life Recycling Act, brought into the Zohar incident. No, not Zohar. The Zohar incident is a military conflict that was already nearing its end by the time that Andrew got to the battlefield, and thus he found he was unable to divine any meaning from his life. When the conflict ended, Andrew and the rest of his ilk were unceremoniously discharged and forced into civilian life. They were bred to kill, but not given any of the tools one would need to be able to thrive and navigate a normal life. Not exactly a smart plan, but we can see its parallels in real life. Some point after his introduction to society, Andrew would go on to commit a murder. And his lawyer's defense is that he was the victim of the combined failure of the Life Recycling Act's lack of training and the lack of government programs that assist transitioning soldiers. Spared capital punishment, our buddy undergoes personality conditioning, a frighteningly dystopian term for an equally dystopian procedure in which the government installs nanomachines in your brain to control your behavior and prescribes a cocktail of medication to keep the procedure from backfiring. Problem solved. Andrew goes on to happily marry his lawyer and sees the promise of better days ahead of him. But then he learns that his lawyer only married him as a means of obtaining a permit to have a child by cloning herself. It's sort of implied here that individuals who undergo personality conditioning are prohibited from having children. Either way, Andrew snaps her neck. He's now been denied meaning through combat, fulfillment through civilian life, and a legacy through having a child. After murdering his wife in a flash of rage, he'd go on to receive personality reconditioning 2 more times, but it always failed to suppress who he was. Eventually, he would go on to murder everyone in the vicinity of the facility. In swoops Margulis, another antagonist with a large presence in the trilogy. Margulis is still an unknown quantity to the audience at this point, but we know he's part of a shadowy organization and that he's prepared for anything.
We may need to implement Plan 31. We've already confirmed all the variables. We'll proceed with Plan 401.
Margulis is actually one of my favorite characters in the trilogy, and the few scenes that he has with Andrew are all we really get in Episode 1 to gain a sense of what kind of person he is. But it all works really well. He arrives at the facility besting Andrew in, well, you can hardly call it combat, but he shows the super soldier that he's not so misunderstood, and that he appreciates Andrew's desire to find a North Star in life. This aligns really well with Margulis' character, who is a devout follower of Ormus, aka space Christianity. Margulis never takes a single action lacking purpose, his singular goal being the realization of his people's divine destiny of retrieving the Zohar and returning to Lost Jerusalem, aka Earth. Margulis is the perfect character to give Cherenkov a new philosophy and purpose, because it informs and reinforces both of their characters so well. We only really get a handful of scenes between the two, but it's clear just how much Andrew looks up to his commander. This relationship is best illustrated in a scene between the two, in which Margulis waxes philosophical about how the people Andrew had met throughout his life were never really people, but empty vessels, products of consumerism who only act to continue their consumption, devoid of any real meaning. The commander goes on to explain that Andrew, who never lost sight of who he was the only real human among them, and that together they could go on to resurrect true human consciousness using the very skills that Andrew's government had fought so hard to suppress. This is awesome character writing. Even though Cherenkov ends up being turned into a Gnosis and is killed off halfway through episode 1, and he's only mentioned once after that, the game still takes the time to develop and focus on him through interactions both small and large, and none of it feels like a waste, because of the way that it plays off of other characters and builds upon the themes that persist throughout the trilogy. This detail, whether I'm referring to constructing compelling character arcs like with Andrew, or referring to the crafting of each internal and external conflict that serve to reinforce the themes of fear or the confronting of our failures, these are the sort of qualities and details in writing that ends up taking the biggest hit by the time we get to episode 2. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. We've covered a lot of in-game material, so it's about time we jump back into the real world and discuss Takahashi and his development team. Episode 1 came out in 2002 in Japan and 2003 here in the States. It received solid reviews and enthusiastic feedback, but it wasn't quite the smash hit that Namco and Monolith Soft were hoping that it would be. Okay, it actually kind of flopped by their standards. As a result, the original blueprint of Xenosaga as a 6-part series was quickly re-evaluated behind the scenes, and changes were made to the core staff. First, Soraya Saga, who co-wrote the script to episode 1 and helped draft the outline of the full series, was replaced by Norihiko Yonesaka, who would then use Takahashi's notes as a guide for writing the second episode. Secondly, Tetsuya Takahashi himself would actually step down as director, a role that was filled by Ko Arai. It's probably safe to say that the reason Takahashi stepped down as director came down to both a decision from Namco and himself. On Namco's part, it might have been due to his penchant for expanding projects as they're in the midst of development. And as far as Takahashi was concerned, he had a very real desire to allow younger developers to take the reins. But I do think there is another factor involved. In 2010, long after Xenosaga met its premature end, Takahashi sat down with then Nintendo CEO Satoru Iwata to discuss the upcoming Xenoblade Chronicles, and he described his mindset going into the project. He stated that at the time, he viewed his top priority as ensuring that the team kept to their deadline, even at the cost of cutting content, which, if you've been paying attention, that sounds like a complete 180 from the stance he held during Xenogears. Here's the most interesting slice from that portion of the interview. There's an old Japanese proverb about a cricket trying to swim across a river. At first, it's swimming away happily, but halfway across, it just seems to give up. I'd worked on a lot of games until Xenoblade, and there were times where I've done the same. So this time, making Xenoblade, I was prepared to accept that I wouldn't be able to achieve all that I set out to, and I was mentally preparing myself to shift directions somewhat. But then Yamagami-san told me to see it through to the end, and I was really taken aback by this experience of Nintendo's willingness to keep working at something until they're satisfied that the job is really done. I think this is a remarkable admission that sheds some light on where his experiences up to that point had led him as a creative. Xenogears and Xenosaga were passion projects that he and his team had poured their hearts into, and their grand plans for the Xeno series had now been cut short twice by 2004. Simply put, I think Takahashi was tired. Tired of having limitations put on his games. tired of having to take shortcuts in his work at the behest of others, and probably tired of being disappointed in himself for not having lived up to his own expectations. Sometime after the release of Episode 1, he confessed that the game had covered only 20% of the material that he intended on covering. That's a staggering amount of subject matter to be admitted when considering that the final product is already 40 hours long with nearly 8 hours of cutscenes. At this point, we've seen 2 Xenoseries projects balloon in scope as they were knee-deep in development, and there's definitely blame to be put on multiple parties for this. Is Takahashi to blame? Sure, as director, one of his many responsibilities includes ensuring that the project is being handled in an efficient, timely manner. It's also undoubtedly the fault of Namco, who, in the case of Xenosaga, were eager to wrap up development and release the game, even if the team believed that it was unfinished. So, take all this into consideration when I say, Xenosaga Episode II is an outline of what was supposed to be the rest of Episode 1. This entry is undoubtedly the most flawed and least loved out of the 3, but I still can't bring myself to call it a bad game. It's definitely not. It's just that the story structure and writing at large just feel so lacking when compared to the bookends of the trilogy. Again, the team that worked on Episode 2 was much different from the team that worked on Episode 1, ergo drastically different from the team that worked on Xenogears. Takahashi had stepped back to take on a new role within Monolith Soft and had given the younger team an outline with his ideas for where the story should go from where they had left off. Despite this roadmap from Takahashi, Xenosaga 2's narrative just barely sticks the landing. At the time of development, the young team was open with the fact that they were taking steps to respond to the criticism of the first installment, part of which led to the decrease of the overall length and amount of cutscenes. They also adapted the character designs to something less anime-like, no doubt in an effort to cast a wider net for their audience. Additionally, this time around, Junior is arguably the main character. Now, this is just my impression, but I can see the new team attempting to project the cool, gun-toting Junior as the main character because, again, they thought it might attract a wider audience. Again, just my impression. Either way, by focusing too much on feedback, cutting a metric ton of content, and scaling back on the amount of high-quality, character-driven writing like what we saw with Cherenkov, the second entry wound up utterly devoid of the same charmed precision that the first and third games possess in abundance. I don't want to dwell on this episode any longer, we've got to keep it moving. Suffice it to say, Soraya Saga stated on her blog that Xenosaga Episode II was a heavily adapted version of our original outline. Takahashi, on the other hand, was a bit more political with his assessment of the game, praising the game's technical achievements and success at making something of their own, but never extending praise to the story it covered, merely saying that it took liberties and cut a fair amount of content. Now, it's 2006. Xenosaga Episodes 1 and 2 have performed well below Namco's expectations, and the crew at Monolith Soft, well, their morale was at a record low. They had poured their hearts and an unknowable amount of time into these projects, and yet, the decision had been made some time ago to end the series with Episode 3. This was bad news for fans like myself, who were keen to see the storyline continue, but it was much better than having no resolution at all. The finale of the series would bring us the end of Shion's arc, which, according to competing sources throughout the years, could have been either just half the intended storyline or as little as a third. Xenosaga 3 has a lot going on. I found that this story sometimes feels as though it was supposed to end in a different fashion or circumstance, as if that, in the interest of providing closure to fans, various elements were pulled from the canned later installments and just implemented in this entry. Or maybe they simply got to the same destination that they had always intended, but used a different road. It's tough to tell. Post-Episode 3 interviews with the development team are rare, if not completely non-existent. The series has occasionally popped up during interviews about subsequent games or in response to fans online, but there's very little concrete information to glean from these moments. So part of the challenge going into Episode 3 was the fact that there was a lot of scrapped content from the second game, meaning that the development team somehow had to find a way to both continue and end Shion's story from that 20% marker way back at the end of Episode 1, maybe 25 or 30% by the end of Episode 2. Soraya Saga has only vaguely stated that cutting down on content for Episode 2 created a lot of difficulties for the final installment of the trilogy. She's also claimed that, as a result, the Xenosaga 3 that we got was radically different from what was envisioned at the outset of the series. Beyond that, there's not much we know about what could have been. It was a tall task, but through the jarring time skip at the beginning of the game, the massive amount of plot to juggle, and the mysteries they had to provide closure to, Episode 3 absolutely nails the landing. Sure, the series remained just as divisive as ever upon release, but critically, it received the same amount of high praise as the first. I'd argue that it was due to having Takahashi back on board. He didn't serve as director, but as script supervisor and scenario supervisor instead. Even with his role technically reduced, it's clear that he had a firm hand on the steering wheel because his fingerprints can be found all over this project, whereas they were almost nowhere to be found in the previous title. This time around, the Xenosaga team was making a game knowing that there wouldn't be any more to follow, and so it was made with the fans in mind. On the writing side, characters were again driving most of the action. Each scene was given the space it needed to play out on its own terms and reach their natural conclusions without feeling too forced. They also found a real balance here as well when it came to doling out gameplay and narrative beats proportionately. Not only is the battling more accessible than ever, but the exploration is more rewarding as well. Yes, it's Xenosaga. Yes, scenes can go way longer than 20 minutes, and yes, this time around, a lot of the dialogue happens in text boxes as opposed to pre-rendered cutscenes. But I can't help but feel that had the first two episodes found the same sense of balance between its narrative and its gameplay as this final outing, the series may not have ended prematurely. In an abstract sense, this final entry into the series has an aura of confidence about itself that the second and first episode lack. But it's by no means perfect, of course. I mean, some story threads were dropped altogether, lightly dismissed, or tied up hastily. Dmitry Yuriev, Junior's dad, who was clearly being teed up to play a much larger role in the previous game, gets the shaft in terms of development from both their script and this one, as he suffers the indignity of being the only two-dimensional villain in the trilogy. But at least the battle theme against him and Omega is an absolute banger. Alright, so what does happen in the conclusion to this trilogy? How does Takahashi's story and all of this become some sort of meditation on the concept of failure? First, Xenosaga always had a bit of an ensemble cast, but the focus is back on Xion. We follow alongside her as she's slowly dying, a byproduct of her will resonating with Udu waves via Cosmos' abilities. Her psyche, which we were just beginning to explore in the first game, really takes a beating this time around. A trip to the past forces her to relive events that caused her pain, and she's unable to change any of the outcomes. The death of friends, the murder of her parents, the challenging of many falsehoods that she believed to be true. It's also upon re-experiencing these events that we're hit with the revelation that it was Xion's grief at the death of her parents that summoned the Gnosis to the galaxy 14 years ago. But most of all, she has to deal with this prick.
Don't ask me why I'm motherfucking stressed. Things done changed.
Kevin Winnicott is the original designer of Cosmos and Xion's ex-boyfriend. He died 2 years before the start of Episode 1, but in a twist we all saw coming, Wilhelm revived Kevin behind the scenes as the leader of the Testaments, a group of space wizards who've left their mortal bodies behind in exchange for power. This was all part of their master plan. While alive, Kevin was manipulative and deceitful, only entering into a relationship with Xion because he knew that she was the reincarnated Maiden of Mary, one of the keys needed to initiate the eternal recurrence. After avoiding the spotlight for a few games, the Red Testament finally unveils his true identity to Xion. But, well, Xion doesn't see the bad in Kevin. Much like music from the 90s, given enough time apart, you only remember the good stuff, and it's kind of the same deal here. In this game, we finally get a view of their relationship untinted by rose-colored glasses, and all the evidence points towards Kevin taking advantage of the pain in Xion's past, leading her to become overly dependent on him as a source of comfort. And of course, that reliance on him only grew stronger the longer they were apart after his supposed death. This all reaches a crescendo in Episode 3's most emotionally charged scene. Near the end of the game, as the party gets ready to confront Wilhelm, Kevin is able to convince Xion to betray her friends and help him with hitting the reset button on the universe. After all, she's felt nothing but pain throughout the course of the 3 games, traveling with her friends and being forced to confront her past. And Kevin is a singular bright spot that she sees in her life, a reminder of this time when she was happy. So she decides to go along with him, not caring that she's just being used by him because she feels, at the very least, that he's the only one who's been there for her. This has abusive relationship written all over it. Thankfully, Alan changes her mind with a speech about the power of friendship, the heart of the cards, and how he'll always love her. It's cheesy, but that's where Xenosaga thrives. Plus, it finally gives Alan an opportunity to shine, as he was largely relegated to the role of comic relief throughout the 3 games. So Kevin is rejected and is at last given the boot. But it's not long after that Kevin decides to betray Wilhelm in order to help Shion. It's wildly out of left field. It kind of feels like the team didn't know how to handle him once his role was pretty much played out, so he was teed up for the briefest of redemption arcs. But no one's really buying it. Well, I'm certainly not. Kevin spent years manipulating Shion, and he wasn't so much stirred by Alan's speech as he was kinda angered and dismissive about the whole thing. Plus, the time between Alan's speech and Kevin's betrayal hovers around 10 minutes at most, so it's a tough sell. If you allow me a moment to put on my critic's hat, it would have made much more sense to have Kevin just double down on his commitment to the Eternal Recurrence shenanigans, if only really to serve as a reinforcement of the positive choice Shion made when leaving him for good. It's another small gripe, but as I've alluded to, the strengths of Episode 3 far outweigh any of its shortcomings. And with that, we've arrived at the ending of the trilogy. So, give me a second before I talk about the ending. Remember Margulis, one of the leaders of Ormus, aka Space Christianity? Well, as the final act of Episode 3 ramps up, Margulis is shocked to learn what we all know, that the Patriarch of Ormus is Wilhelm, who's been using the religious group for his own gain. The double whammy comes when Wilhelm divulges his true aspirations, and that the religion's purpose of returning to Earth was also fabricated. As Margulis, the methodical tactician, begins to break down over the sudden realization that his actions have served no purpose, Wilhelm tells him something interesting. He says, "It wasn't meaningless as long as you, yourself, believed it wasn't meaningless." Wilhelm's maybe not the best guy to pull that quote from, considering the context, but I'll take it, because there's a perspective that we can view that quote in that I'd like to revisit in a few minutes, so just keep that in mind. When I made my decision to re-examine this series and explore why it made such an impact on me, what I came away with was this rumination on the meaning of failure and how we can choose to confront it. While I didn't recognize it for what it was when I was 16, the implications of Xenosaga's final moments have stayed with me regardless, and I think it remains so poignant because of how tonally different it is from what you might usually see from the genre, because the ending to the trilogy is resoundingly bittersweet. Shion and the rest don't really save the world, or the universe more accurately. Not really. The job isn't finished. Instead, they find themselves only really able to postpone what Wilhelm had told them was inevitable. For a time, they're able to keep the Great Collapse at bay, but it will happen eventually. Maybe. Although, they do learn that there may be a way to prevent it for good if they can find Earth. For the record, Margulis is left so broken by the revelation of Wilhelm's deceit that he actively pursues death, no longer caring for the outcome of the events that he helped set in motion. He seeks out Shion's brother Jin, who he's had a bit of a feud with, but in the end he takes his own life, because at the very least, he could gain some small measure of satisfaction by not allowing his foe to deliver the final blow. What's refreshing and memorable about all this is that it feels like a natural end for its core cast of characters. None of it relies on the tropes of the genre to use the ending as a means of repairing all the problems that arose throughout the course of the story, or to stage some massive epic battle. In spite of its high stakes, the last leg of the narrative manages to feel very quiet and intimate at times. Shion, Ziggy, Jr., and much of the others spend so much of the trilogy being confronted with their pasts and being challenged to face their fears and failures, so it makes sense that the endgame became less about saving the world and killing the bad guy, and more about showing their newfound strength by saying no to the Eternal Recurrence, which I view as the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card for skirting self-improvement. After years of attempting to shoulder grief on her own and seeing that it's caused her isolation, Shion finally begins to learn how to open up to others. Ziggy, who I sadly haven't gone over in the slightest, is a man reborn as a combat cyborg following a rather complicated death. Ziggy took his own life after the murder of his wife and stepson, and since coming back, he's taken on government missions as a means of replacing old body parts with synthetics, and looks to eventually erase the memories of his past life. Over the course of the trilogy, the bond that Ziggy forms with Momo and his run-ins with the man who murdered his family reminds him just how human he still is. He begins to slowly reassess the value of his relationships with others. In the end, Ziggy chooses to keep his family's memory alive and honors what little time he had with them by continuing to care for Momo. Lastly, Junior learns to forgive himself for his past mistakes. As an added bonus, he's able to make peace with Albedo, who makes a return in the final episode as one of Wilhelm's testaments. No longer bound to his mortal body, Albedo is able to join his consciousness with Junior's and finally fade away. Our core cast of characters have persevered through it all, and having learned to accept a whole lot about themselves that they didn't like, the crew shows their resolve by deciding that, even at the risk of failure, they'll reject Wilhelm's plan, because they had seen that remaining in their own status quo had only prolonged their pain, and they had learned that while moving past their inner turmoil was difficult, it provided them with the opportunity to find happiness once more. The same holds true for the universe. If things kept repeating themselves as a means of avoiding destruction, then there would never even be an opportunity to find if there was a way from preventing the collapse for good. In the end, Wilhelm is killed by an unredeemable Kevin, the eternal recurrence is no longer an option, and the party then has to escape from the planet. So Shion says her goodbye to both Cosmos and her brother Jin. They stay behind to buy time for Chaos, who's decided to stay back in order to halt the recurrence. For Jin, it's a choice that costs him his life, and he's prepared for it. The invisible infrastructure that made faster-than-light possible within the fictional galaxy then collapses, making spacefaring much more arduous than it was before. The pathway to Earth has reopened, and they know that the key to keeping the collapse of the universe from happening is somewhere there, but the journey to Earth won't be like the quick trips that they're used to. There's an air of finality to the parting of the group, as Momo and Ziggy stay back to help rebuild things, and Shion, Alan, and Junior set off in search of Earth. The trip could take years. They may not even find it in their own lifetime. If so, it would mean that the task would have to be entrusted to future generations. But in the face of all that uncertainty, they set out anyways. And that's it. Tetsuya Takahashi mentioned that there were points where he sort of gave up. I don't blame him. It's easy to draw a parallel between the ending of Xenosaga and what the game's developers were experiencing on a professional and maybe even personal level. For Takahashi and the rest of the team that followed him from Square, this was the second major project that was unable to live up to their vision. It's interesting to me, therefore, that the finale of their series features a group of heroes who are all striving to confront and overcome personal setbacks because of the knowledge that it's worth risking failure for a shot at a better tomorrow. Pursuing something that you're passionate about, whatever it is difficult, but it's also one of the most fulfilling things that you can do. I know what it's like to have ideas in your head that you need to put on page or bring to life. Otherwise, it becomes like an itch that you can't scratch. There's a mixture of excitement and fulfillment that comes with exploring your passion, but there can also be apprehension when faced with the thought of sharing it with the world. Like, will they see what you saw and feel what you felt? I'm also well acquainted with the fact that having your ideas and work rejected can take a lot out of you. It can make you question yourself. And I think that's okay. I think it's okay to fall down. It's okay to give up or rethink your path. Mostly because I think there's a lot to gain just from the pursuit itself, even if it's just happiness. Maybe the end result wasn't what you expected, but I don't believe that cheapens the journey in any way. It wasn't meaningless as long as you yourself believe that it wasn't meaningless. Not what Wilhelm meant, but I think when taken in this way, it's a perspective that is useful every now and again. The ending of Xenosaga and the story behind the series' development reinforces the idea that there's a path even beyond our worst setbacks, and that we can choose how to value the moments where we fall short of our own expectations. We can either allow it to define us and become some sort of character-defining monument, or we can take pride in where we got, make note of where we need to go, and use it as a stepping stone to something better. Monolith Soft, for what it's worth, was purchased by Nintendo shortly after the Saga trilogy was completed. A few years later, in 2010, they released Xenoblade Chronicles 1, written and directed by Tetsuya Takahashi, and it was instantly labeled as a masterpiece. Since then, they've released several more Chronicle games and have been riding a pretty steady wave of success, and I'm happy for them, especially because of how demoralizing the cancellation of Xenosaga was for them. They fought really hard to make their vision a reality, but in the end they fell short. And again, that's okay. Now, the team has a level of creative freedom that they could have scarcely imagined back then. Would it have been great if we got the full, unabridged version of Xenosaga that they had envisioned? Sure, but I'm happy with what we got. After all, it's 15 years later and I'm still thinking about it. So, why would anyone say that they failed?